Greetings and welcome back to room 303, and our Talks with Walt is what we're calling our readings now through Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the Deathbed Edition. We are now in Song of Myself, passage 16. Think of it, we're roughly a quarter now of the way through Song of Myself. And that section that we called 8 through 16, the great catalog section, now in some ways comes to its conclusion. We mentioned in our last lecture the referencing to Iliad 2 and the ways in which that's important, and as well that passage from Song of Myself number 4, both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. My assumption is that you've been following us, speaking of prior lectures, at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side, find that playlist of Talks with Walt. We've covered the 24 poems of inscription, the 19 sections of Paumanok, and we've worked all the way now up through passage 15 of Song of Myself. And we turn now to passage 16. Because of the length of it, I'm not going to read it as I like to do initially. And just like we pointed out in prior sections, there's a couple of lines that were edited out here that we're going to find fascinating. Sounding very much like the Exodus I am verse of Exodus 3:14. We'll begin with this I am, and we're going to see this all the way through Leaves of Grass, but certainly through Song of Myself. I am of old and young. And you get this sense, after all of the listing that's transpired to this point, the cataloging that's transpired, the rewriting or extending beyond in Iliad 2, as we commented in the last lecture, now he's ready to come to its conclusion. If 15 was very specific in the kinds of focus that he had, we're going to see a more general kind of almost like national understanding here as the celebration of America and democracy. I am of old and young, of the foolish as much as the wise. His inclusivity is obviously vital, right? Regardless of others, ever regardful of others, will always be playing the game of respect. You're going to hear this again and again. I may be, he says, ready to leave behind certain ideas, but I'm going to show respect to those ideas. That is to say, the new is the new. The NEW is the KNEW. We are the stories we tell and retell. We're also the stories we decide to accept or reject. And in that rejecting, he always wants to show a certain kind of respect. He calls it maternal as well as paternal, a child as well as a man. In other words, I'm trying to cover all sides of the issue, stuffed with the stuff that is coarse and stuff with the stuff that is fine, in other words, rough as well as refined, sounding very much like Coleridge's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner in those final lines, all things both great and small, right? For the dear God loveth us, he made and loveth all, right? One of the nation of many nations, here capitalized nation, the word nation, in the 1855 it was not capitalized, and it was the great nation, but here it's one of the nation of many nations, the smallest the same, and the largest the same. Again, very much like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. In other words, the opening lines of passage 16, as we're coming down to the conclusion of this kind of categorization, is to say, everything matters. Now he's going to turn to America as a nation, and we're going to celebrate all of the different sections of America. Now, depending upon whether this poem was read in 1855 or later on in the 1880s, as the Deathbed Edition is about to be released, will have a different feel, obviously because of the Civil War. Of course, in 1855, we're bringing all emphasis on all of the different states. And what are those states? A Southerner soon as a Northerner, right? So obviously, we're going to read this differently when we're past the Civil War. A planter nonchalant and hospitable, down by the Okinee I live, the native tribes referenced here. Again, starting from Paumanok passage 16, we've spoken about this already. A Yankee bound by my own way, ready for trade, my joints the limberest joints on earth and the sternest joints on earth. In other words, I am, he says, a Yankee that is bound my own way. Now this bound my own way, we're going to come back to it in Song of the Open Road, afoot and lighthearted. I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading Wherever I choose. It is that choosing, it's that freedom he's going to celebrate. And then we're going to, emphasize different elements of America. We saw this to some degree already in starting from Paumanok, which is why I said some of that listing that was in Paumanok is setting us up for the listing that we're looking at now. A Kentuckian, walking the Vale of the Elkhorn in my deerskin. We've had deerskin leggings. We've had references to rivers before. A Louisianian, a Georgian. By the way, those two were not in the 1855. He added those. A boatman over lakes or bays or along coasts. And then he'll say a Hoosier, a Hoosier, Badger, Buckeye. In the 1855, he actually put A in front of each of those. And, of course, Hoosiers are from Indiana, Badgers are Wisconsin, and Buckeyes are from Ohio. We then have an interesting edited line that runs like this. He says, a Hoosier, a Badger, a Buckeye, I'm now reading from the 1855, a Louisianian or Georgian, we saw this earlier, a poke, easy, from sand hills and pines. This poke is a fascinating word. I mean, we talked about pokeweed at the conclusion, of course, of Song of Myself 5. To poke has all kinds of interesting connotations. I can poke you to try to get you to pay attention. And of course, poke has its sexual slang as well. And then we'll come back to it. At home on Canadian snowshores, by the way, Canadian in the original 55 was spelled with a C, and then by the deathbed edition is spelled with this traditional K, as we've spoken about elsewhere. At home on Canadian snowshoes, or up in the bush, or with fishermen off Newfoundland, at home in the fleet of ice boats, sailing with the rest and tacking. Of course, fishing is a huge part of what Whitman knew in his life. At home, notice all of these at home. In other words, America is his home no matter where he is. At home in the hills of Vermont, or in the woods of Maine, or the Texan ranch. We've got all over the U.S. we're talking now. Of course, America we're talking. But notice, as we've pointed out, when I heard America, I Hear America Singing. Notice how he rarely uses the word America. He's talking about America. He just doesn't use the actual word. Comrade will get repeated 3 or more times. Comrade of Californians. Comrade of free Northwesterners. And again, just to remind that Whitman was part of that Free Staters debate as it related to abolition. Loving their big proportions, said in parenthetics, he loves the idea of the vastness of the land of America. Comrade of raftsmen and coalmen, comrade of all who shake hands and welcome to drink and meat. Back to the Odyssey and the celebration of meals and cuisine. A learner with the simplest, a teacher of the thoughtfulest. And this again is Whitman as pedagogue, right? In other words, I want to be a learner with the simplest. I want to have that beginner's mind. Also a teacher of the thoughtfulest. And I think by passage 46, 47, I am the teacher of athletes. It will become, much of this will come to fruition. A novice, beginning, yet experient of myriads of seasons. In other words, I'm both. He is 37 years old when he starts the poem. So in other words, he obviously has lived nearly 40 years. But still he says, I want to be a novice and still experient of myriads of seasons. Of every hue and caste am I, of every rank and religion. I think the original on this one is a fascinating thing to read as well from the 55 edition. He writes it this way, a novice beginning, experient of myriads of seasons, of every hue and trade and rank, of every caste and religion, so notice the changing in the word order, not merely of the New World, but of Africa, Europe, or Asia. And then he has an ellipsis, and then one of the more remarkable single lines of the original Song of Myself, a wandering savage. Now, it's always an interesting question why Whitman chose to edit out what he chose to edit out. A wandering savage is, of course, a fascinating line, and the fact that he would also mention Africa, all those lines are edited out, and instead he'll say, of every hue and caste am I, of every rank and religion. And then he'll give us 12 different, very quickly, different kinds of professions. A farmer, mechanic, artist, gentleman, sailor. Quaker is interesting, but not capitalized. He does, by the way, have the word lover as well in the original. Prisoner, that's interesting. Fancy man, rowdy, lawyer, physician, priest. Again, this is kind of remarkable, the way in which he will assume all of those different kinds of people. And we've said this about reading Whitman to get ready to read T.S. Eliot, or reading Eliot to understand Whitman better, in 4 quartets. Oh, dark, 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 they all go into the dark, the vacant interstellar spaces, and then Eliot just starts to list of captains, bankers, merchants, men of letters, generous patrons of the arts, blah, 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 blah. It's very similar, and I think Eliot learned that kind of thing and played it out in a text like East Coker so easily because of his study of something like this. Notice the range of it, right? From farmers to mechanics to artists to gentlemen, all of a sudden thrown in the middle of it, to sailors to Quakers, which is interesting, to prisoner. He's gonna comment several times on incarcerated peoples and the way that he identifies with them just as much as he identifies with the next line. Fancy man, rowdy, we're going to hear this word again, lawyer, physician, priest. We think, of course, about the priest and the poet that are set before Odysseus at the end of the Odyssey, as we covered it before. Now he'll finish with 6 lines and 2 stanzas. I resist anything better than my own diversity. In other words, inclusivity. I'm gonna celebrate everything. Diversity. Breathe the air, but leave plenty after me. In other words, I will breathe the air. There's so much air of America, you can't breathe it all up. And then, one of the more interesting lines in A Song of Myself, am not stuck up, and am in my place. So notice we're at home, or we're in our place, and he says it, I am not stuck up. Now this stuck up, of course, is a euphemism, which will mean arrogant or conceited. And that's fascinating, because sometimes Whitman will seem extremely elitist and kind of more impressed with himself than maybe you would think anyone other than a narcissist would be. But notice here, he says, I'm not stuck up. For each atom belonging to me as well belongs to you, is the way he said at the beginning of Song of Myself. I'm not stuck up, he says. I'm not. I am a man of the people, of everyone. En masse will be the way he uses it later. And then in parentheses to finish this with 3 lines, it's almost like an afterthought, but I think it's brilliant. And it does play along with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner lines that we've commented on elsewhere at learnstrong.net. Notice he says, the moth and fish eggs are in their place. Nature is all balanced. The bright suns I see and the dark suns I cannot see are in their place. The palpable is in its place, and the impalpable is in its place. Notice the repetitions of the word place 3 times now at the end of the line to give us a sense that everything is well ordered. And of course that makes sense for us to use the word ordered, because what has he been doing? He's been giving us lots and lots of lists in order, right? So in other words, as we kind of come to this little mini section within Song of Myself, as we've said, passages 8 through 16, have this tendency towards cataloging. We want to just stop now and pay attention to the genius of the way this has worked itself out. At 2a, again, all things are in their place. All things are connected. All things are somehow balanced in remarkable ways. At 2b, of course, the end of our listing here, we're going to see more listing in Leaves of Grass, but we're probably never going to see something quite like what we have seen. Just this amazing ubiquity of all that is America, to give us a sense of it, both from the specific to the general. At 3a, there's so many titles that come to mind here, but I just want to mention one more time, as we did with starting from Paumanok, that Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land of 1944 couldn't have been written without some of this kind of listing happening. And then as well at 3a, I mean, think about when you pick up the Christian or the Judeo-Christian Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible has these listings that we will find. Obviously, if you just start reading the New Testament, what's the very first thing you see? Well, listings of genealogies, and we're going to be playing a very similar game here. Finally, at 3b, of all the listing that you've now been through with me, 8 through 16, which for you is the most powerful, which for you is the most disturbing? And then finally, do you feel that you are in your place? And to what degree do you feel comfortable with where you are? And how can we better find our way to our own place? I hope that our studies with Walt Whitman will help us get there. And now we come back to passage 17 and we move on into Song of Myself. Thank you.